In the heart of a forgotten valley, surrounded by hills cloaked in mist, lay the small village of Elder Glen. Its crumbling homes, built of weathered stone and patched roofs, were a testament to years of neglect and poverty. The villagers, dressed in tattered garments, eked out a living from the stubborn soil, their days marked by struggle and resignation. Among them was Leila, a 17-year-old girl whose bright eyes were a rare contrast to the dreary surroundings. With her raven-black hair tied loosely behind her head, she moved gracefully despite the burden of her daily chores. Leila's life was a symphony of labor, fetching water from the distant well, tending to her sickly mother, and ensuring her younger brother Samuel had enough to eat. The village whispered of her resilience, though many dismissed her dreams as foolish. She spoke of a world beyond the hills, of places where the sky stretched endlessly, unbroken by the weight of poverty. "Hope," she would say, "is the one thing they can't take from us." One grey morning, as frost clung to the window panes, a herald arrived in Elder Glen. His arrival was rare, for the village seldom received visitors from the capital. Dressed in the royal colours of crimson and gold, he rode a sleek black horse that seemed out of place amidst the village's humble livestock. Gathering the townsfolk in the central square, he unfurled a parchment bearing the royal seal. "By decree of His Majesty King Edward," he proclaimed, "each village under the Crown's protection must send one able-bodied servant to the royal palace. This service shall be considered a debt of loyalty to the throne." The villagers exchanged anxious glances. Many feared the unknown fate awaiting anyone chosen. For Leila, it was a chance, perhaps her only one, to escape the clutches of Elder Glen's despair. Yet she hesitated, knowing her family needed her. When the elder of the village called for a volunteer, silence gripped the square. Then, amidst the murmurs and uncertainty, Leila stepped forward. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "I will go." Her mother's eyes filled with tears as she reached out to hold her daughter. "Leila, no, we need you here." Leila placed a comforting hand on her mother's. "This is my chance, Mama. I promise I'll find a way to send help." The herald nodded approvingly, unaware of the turmoil brewing in her heart. "You shall leave at dawn. Bring what you need, though the palace shall provide for you." That night, Leila sat by the fire, gazing at the flickering flames. Samuel, barely 10, clung to her arm. "Will you come back?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "I will," she assured him, though the words felt hollow. "And when I do, things will be better, for all of us." As dawn broke, the villagers gathered to see her off. She carried a small bundle containing her only possessions, a faded shawl, a leather-bound notebook where she wrote her thoughts, and a simple wooden comb carved by her father before his passing. The herald helped her onto the horse that would take her to the capital. As they rode away, Leila stole one last glance at Elder Glen, her heart heavy with a mix of fear and determination. Little did she know that the journey ahead would test her spirit in ways she could never imagine, and that her courage would soon entwine her fate with that of the king himself. The journey to the capital was a stark contrast to the world Leila had always known. As the horses' hooves clattered against the cobblestone roads, she marveled at the changing landscapes. The dense forests of Elder Glen gave way to rolling meadows, dotted with wildflowers in hues she had never seen before. Rivers sparkled under the midday sun, their clear waters flowing with a serenity that seemed foreign to her. The herald, who introduced himself as Marcus, was a man of few words. His sharp eyes scanned the path ahead, ever vigilant. Leila, sitting unsteadily on the horse behind him, found herself torn between fear and curiosity. "What is the palace like?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Marcus glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "Grand," he replied curtly. "But it is no place for idle dreams. Remember your duty, girl." His response sent a chill through her, but she pressed no further. Instead, she turned her attention back to the road, her mind racing with questions. What awaited her within those towering walls? Would she be treated kindly, or would her life become an endless chain of servitude? As the hours passed, they reached the outskirts of the capital. The first glimpse of the city left Leila breathless. Stone walls, taller than anything she had ever seen, surrounded the bustling streets. Inside, merchants called out their wares and children darted between the crowds, their laughter ringing through the air. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the tang of spices, a combination that made her stomach rumble. But there was no time to stop. Marcus urged the horse forward, navigating through the maze of streets until the palace gates loomed before them. They were immense, wrought of iron, and adorned with intricate carvings of lions and eagles, symbols of the royal house. 2 guards stood at attention, their polished armor gleaming. They nodded at Marcus and stepped aside, allowing the gates to swing open. Leila's breath caught as they entered the palace grounds. The gardens stretched as far as the eye could see, filled with vibrant flowers, marble fountains, and perfectly trimmed hedges. The palace itself was a marvel of architecture, its spires piercing the sky. Dismounting, Marcus gestured for Leila to follow. "Come, you'll be taken to the steward. He'll assign your duties." Leila hesitated, her legs stiff from the journey, but she quickly obeyed. Inside the palace, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of polished wood and burning candles. Servants scurried about, their footsteps muffled by the plush carpets. The steward, a thin, stern-looking man named Aldrich, regarded her with a critical eye. "You'll start in the kitchens," he declared after a brief introduction. "Fetch water, scrub pots, and stay out of trouble. Do your work well, and you may earn better tasks." Leila nodded, keeping her gaze lowered. As Aldrich dismissed her, a young maid named Clara stepped forward. "I'll show you around," Clara said with a warm smile. "Don't mind Aldrich. He's harsh, but he's fair." Grateful for the kindness, Leila followed Clara through the labyrinthine corridors. Along the way, Clara pointed out various rooms, the grand dining hall, the servants' quarters, and the king's private wing, which was strictly off-limits. "Has anyone ever seen the king?" Leila asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. Clara's smile faded. "Not often. He keeps to himself these days. They say he's not the man he once was." The words lingered in Leila's mind as they reached the kitchens. The clamour of clanging pots and bustling cooks was overwhelming, but Leila threw herself into the work, determined to prove her worth. As the day stretched into night, exhaustion weighed on her, but she found solace in the thought that she was one step closer to a better future. Unbeknownst to her, fate had already begun weaving her into the fabric of the palace, and her path was about to cross with the king's in ways she could never have imagined. The days in the palace began to blur together for Leila. From the break of dawn until the late hours of the night, she scrubbed, carried, and cooked. Her hands, once soft, became calloused, and her body ached from the unrelenting labor. Yet, amidst the exhaustion, there was an undercurrent of curiosity that kept her spirit alive. She noticed things others seemed to overlook. The whispered conversations between the noble advisers, the hurried footsteps echoing through empty halls, and the locked doors that no one dared to approach. There was a tension in the palace, subtle yet pervasive, as if a storm were brewing beneath the surface. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Leila found herself unable to sleep. The servants' quarters were quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden beams. The moonlight filtered through the small, frosted window, casting faint silver patterns on the walls. Unable to quell her restlessness, she decided to wander the halls. The palace at night was a different world, silent, almost eerie, with shadows dancing along the walls. She walked cautiously, her bare feet barely making a sound on the cold stone floor. As she turned a corner, she heard voices. Pressing herself against the wall, she crept closer, her heart pounding in her chest. Two men stood in the corridor, their backs to her. One was the steward, Aldrich, his rigid posture unmistakable. The other was a man she didn't recognize, tall, with sharp features and a cold demeanor. "The king grows weaker by the day," the stranger said in a low voice. "If we don't act soon, we'll lose our chance." Aldrich shifted uneasily. "You speak of treason, Lord Harkon. I have no desire to—" "Treason?" Harkon interrupted, his tone laced with disdain. "I speak of survival. The kingdom needs a leader with strength, not a relic clinging to the past." Leila's breath caught. She dared not move, fearing even the slightest sound would reveal her presence. Aldrich hesitated before responding. "And if we're discovered?" "We won't be," Harkon replied confidently. "The servants are too afraid to speak, and the king is blind to what happens around him. All we need is the right moment." Their voices grew fainter as they walked away, leaving Leila alone in the shadows. Her mind raced. What she had overheard wasn't just idle gossip, it was a plot against the king. Returning to the servants' quarters, she struggled to process what she had heard. The image of the king, isolated and vulnerable, tugged at her. Though she had never met him, she felt an odd sense of duty to warn him. But how could she, a mere servant, approach the king? And even if she could, would he believe her? The next morning, Leila went about her tasks with a heavy heart. The palace seemed unchanged, but she knew better. Beneath its grandeur lay secrets that could shake the very foundation of the kingdom. As she carried a tray of bread to the dining hall, she caught sight of Clara. Pulling her aside, she whispered, "Clara, have you ever heard of Lord Harkon?" Clara's expression darkened. "Stay away from him," she warned. "He's one of the king's advisors, but he's dangerous." "Why do you ask?" Leila hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I just heard some things," she said vaguely. Clara frowned, but didn't press further. "Be careful, Leila. This palace isn't as safe as it seems." Her words only confirmed what Leila already knew. As the day wore on, she resolved to find a way to protect the king, even if it meant risking her own safety. Little did she know, her actions that night had already set events into motion. The shadows of the palace were alive, and they had taken notice of her. Leila's chance to see the king came sooner than she expected. One morning, as she was scrubbing the floors of the grand hall, a messenger arrived with urgent orders. "You," he said, pointing at her. "The steward has requested you to serve in the private wing today. Report there at once." Leila froze. The private wing was a place of mystery. Servants rarely spoke of it, and those who worked there often returned silent and pale. Suppressing a surge of unease, she nodded and followed the messenger. The private wing was quieter than the rest of the palace. Its corridors were dimly lit, and the air felt heavier, as if burdened by years of unspoken truths. She was led to a modest sitting room, where Aldrich awaited her. "You are to serve the king his morning tea," Aldrich instructed, placing a silver tray in her hands. His sharp gaze lingered on her for a moment. "Speak only when spoken to. Do not linger, understood?" "Yes, sir," Leila replied, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. With a nod, Aldrich opened the door to the king's chamber and gestured for her to enter. The room was grand but solemn, its walls lined with shelves of dusty books and faded tapestries. Near the window sat the king, his back to her. His figure was frail, his once regal frame diminished with age. Leila approached cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick rug. Placing the tray on a small table beside him, she waited for acknowledgement. "You're not one of my usual servants," the king said after a long silence. His voice, though weak, carried a commanding undertone. "No, your majesty," Leila replied, keeping her head bowed. "I was sent to serve you today." King Edward turned slightly, revealing a face marked by deep lines and weary eyes. He studied her for a moment before gesturing toward the tea. Pour. Her hands trembled as she filled the delicate porcelain cup. As she placed it before him, her curiosity got the better of her. She glanced at his face, searching for a glimpse of the man he once was. "What is your name?" he asked suddenly, catching her off guard. "Leila, your majesty." He nodded, his gaze distant. "And what brings a girl like you to the palace?" "I came from Elderglen, your majesty. My village. It struggles. I thought serving here might help my family." For a moment, the king's expression softened. "Elderglen. I remember it well. A small, quiet place." "Yes, your majesty," Leila replied, unsure of what else to say. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Leila gathered her courage. "Your majesty, may I speak freely?" The king raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her boldness. "You may." "There are whispers in the palace," she began cautiously. "Whispers of betrayal. I overheard things." His expression darkened, and he leaned forward slightly. "What things?" Leila hesitated, fearing she had overstepped, but she pressed on, her voice barely above a whisper. "A man named Lord Harkin. He spoke of your weakness and plans to act against you." King Edward's eyes narrowed, his frailty momentarily overshadowed by a flicker of the strength he once possessed. "And why do you tell me this, girl? What do you hope to gain?" "Nothing, your majesty," she said earnestly. "I only wish to serve loyally. I thought you should know." For a long moment he said nothing, his gaze piercing. Then he nodded slowly. "You are brave, Leila, perhaps too brave for your own good. But I will remember this." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, and she left the room, her heart pounding. As she stepped into the corridor, Aldrich was waiting, his expression unreadable. "Well?" he asked. "I served the tea as instructed," she replied, her face carefully neutral. Aldrich studied her for a moment before nodding. "Good. Return to your duties." Leila obeyed, but her mind was racing. She had taken a risk, and she had no way of knowing how the king would react, or if her warning had come too late. Deep within the palace, the wheels of fate were turning, and Leila had unknowingly placed herself at the center of a dangerous game. Days passed after Leila's encounter with the king, and the weight of her secret lingered heavily on her shoulders. Though she returned to her regular duties in the kitchens, her mind was often elsewhere, replaying the king's words and the look in his weary eyes. She wondered if he had acted on her warning, or if her words had fallen on deaf ears. Her unease only deepened when she began noticing subtle changes in the palace. Guards patrolled the corridors more frequently, their faces tense and watchful. Servants whispered nervously among themselves, though none dared speak openly of what was happening. Even Clara, usually cheerful, seemed more reserved. "You've been quiet," Clara said one evening as they prepared vegetables for the evening meal. "Is something bothering you?" Leila hesitated. Clara had been kind to her, but trust was a dangerous thing in the palace. "Just tired," she replied with a faint smile. Clara studied her for a moment before nodding. "We all are. The palace has felt different lately." Leila said nothing, though her heart raced. She wasn't the only one who felt the shift in the air. That night, unable to sleep, Leila found herself wandering the corridors again. The palace, shrouded in darkness, seemed almost alive with secrets. She walked carefully, avoiding the guards, her curiosity driving her forward. As she passed near the private wing, faint voices reached her ears. She paused, pressing herself against the cold stone wall. The door to a small meeting room was slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see a group of men gathered inside. Among them was Lord Harkin. His sharp features were illuminated by the flickering light of a single candle. "The king suspects nothing," Harkin said, his voice calm and confident. "He's too weak to act even if he does." "And the girl?" another man asked, his voice low. Leila's breath caught. Were they talking about her? "She is of no consequence," Harkin replied dismissively. "If she heard anything, she wouldn't dare speak. The servants know their place." The men laughed quietly, the sound sending a chill down Leila's spine. "But we must move quickly," Harkin continued. "The council grows restless, and the people are losing faith. When the time comes, we will act decisively." Leila didn't wait to hear more. Fear and adrenaline propelled her back to the servants' quarters, her mind racing. They knew about her, even if they didn't see her as a threat. For now, at least, she was safe. But for how long? The next morning, Leila resolved to warn the king again. She couldn't stand by while danger loomed over him, but reaching him a second time would be far more difficult. The guards near his chambers were more vigilant, and Aldrich seemed to watch her more closely than ever. As she scrubbed the floors of the great hall, an idea struck her. She would write a letter. It was risky, but it was her best chance. That night, by the dim light of a single candle, she carefully wrote out a warning on a scrap of parchment. "Your Majesty, danger surrounds you. Lord Harkin and his men plot against the throne. Trust no one but your most loyal servants. Please act swiftly before it's too late." She folded the note and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. The next day, while delivering linens to the private wing, she managed to leave the note on a table outside the king's chamber. Her heart pounded as she walked away, praying that the right person would find it. But fate had other plans. As she turned a corner, she came face to face with Aldrich. His sharp eyes fell to the pocket of her apron, where the edge of another piece of parchment, a decoy she had planned to destroy, peeked out. "What's this?" he asked, his voice cold. Leila's stomach dropped. "Just a list for the kitchens," she lied, her voice trembling. Aldrich's eyes narrowed as he snatched the paper from her pocket. Though it was blank, his suspicion was clear. "Be careful, girl," he warned. "The palace is no place for secrets." As he walked away, Leila exhaled shakily. She had avoided discovery for now, but the danger was closing in. The wheels of rebellion were turning faster, and Leila was running out of time to protect herself and the king. The days following the note's delivery were a blur of tension and fear. Leila went about her duties, her head low, her ears constantly alert for any whispers or signs that the note had been discovered. She didn't know if the king had read it or if it had been intercepted. The uncertainty gnawed at her. One evening, as she scrubbed the stone floor of the grand dining hall, a shadow loomed over her. Looking up, she saw a guard in full armor, his face stern. "The king requests your presence," he said. Leila's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had the note reached him? Had he called her to thank her or to punish her for overstepping her place? She nodded mutely and followed the guard through the labyrinthine corridors of the palace. When they reached the king's chamber, the guard opened the heavy wooden door and gestured for her to enter. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the glow of a single candle casting long shadows on the walls. King Edward sat in his chair by the window, his figure bathed in moonlight. "You sent for me, Your Majesty?" Leila said, her voice trembling as she curtsied. The king turned to her slowly, his piercing eyes sharper than she remembered. In his hand was the folded note she had left. "Is this your doing?" he asked, holding it up. Leila's heart pounded. There was no point in lying. "Yes, Your Majesty." The king's gaze bore into her for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then, to her surprise, his expression softened. "You are either very brave or very foolish." "I only wish to protect you, Your Majesty," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. King Edward leaned back in his chair, his frailty more evident up close. "Do you understand the risk you've taken? If this had fallen into the wrong hands—" "I do, Your Majesty," Leila replied. "But I couldn't stand by and do nothing." For the first time, a faint smile touched the king's lips. "Loyalty is a rare thing in these walls. You may have saved my life, girl." The weight of his words stunned her. She had acted out of instinct, never imagining the full gravity of what she had done. "Tell me," the king continued, "what else have you seen or heard?" Leila recounted everything she could remember about the night she overheard Lord Harken's plans. The king listened intently, his expression growing darker with each detail. When she finished, he nodded. "You've done well, Leila. But this is far from over. Harken is cunning, and his reach extends further than you know. Is there anything I can do to help, Your Majesty?" she asked, surprising even herself with her boldness. The king studied her for a moment. "Perhaps," he said thoughtfully. "But for now, return to your duties. Speak of this to no one. I will act when the time is right." Leila curtsied and left the chamber, her mind spinning. The king believed her. He was preparing to act. But what would that mean for her and for the palace? As she made her way back to the servants' quarters, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier. She hurried to her bed, pulling the thin blanket over herself, and tried to calm her racing thoughts. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the palace grew even tenser. Guards were stationed at every corner, and whispers of unrest reached even the lowliest servants. Leila kept her head down, avoiding Aldrich and the other nobles as much as possible. Then one evening, as she was cleaning in the grand hall, Clara approached her, her face pale. "Leila," Clara whispered urgently, "something's happening. The guards are searching the servants' quarters. They're looking for something. Or someone." Leila's blood ran cold. Had Harken discovered her involvement? Before she could respond, the grand doors of the hall swung open, and a group of guards entered, led by Aldrich. "You," Aldrich said, pointing directly at Leila. "Come with us." Every eye in the hall turned to her. Leila's heart pounded as she stood, her legs trembling. She followed the guards, trying to steady her breathing. They led her not to a prison cell as she had feared, but to a small, dimly lit room deep within the palace. To her astonishment, the king was there, seated at a table. "Sit," he commanded, his tone firm. Leila obeyed, her hands trembling in her lap. "You've been accused of conspiring against the crown," Aldrich announced, his voice cold. "What?" Leila gasped. "That's not true." The king raised a hand, silencing her. "Leila," he said, his voice softer, "I trust you. But we must tread carefully. Harken is watching, and any misstep could be fatal for both of us. Leila nodded, her fear giving way to determination. She was caught in a web of lies and danger, but she would not falter. She had chosen her path, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. As the king outlined his plan to uncover the traitors, Leila realized that her role in Leila's heart raced as she sat in the dimly lit room, her eyes fixed on the king. His words had been quiet, deliberate, but they carried an air of finality. He was preparing for something, but she wasn't sure exactly what. All she knew was that the time for silence and hiding was over. "Leila," King Edward's voice broke through her thoughts. "You've done well to warn me, but now I need you to help me. We have little time before Harkon's betrayal takes full shape." Her stomach twisted with a mix of fear and determination. "What do you need from me, Your Majesty?" He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense. "I cannot trust anyone in the palace, not fully. Too many have been bought by power, and the rest are too afraid to act. But you—" He paused, his eyes softening. "You have no reason to lie, no reason to conceal the truth. That is why I trust you." Leila swallowed hard. Her role in the palace had always been insignificant, nothing more than a nameless servant. But now she found herself at the heart of a dangerous game, one where a single misstep could lead to her death or worse. "I will do whatever is needed, Your Majesty," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear swirling inside her. The king nodded slowly. "There is a gathering of my most trusted advisors tomorrow night. It is vital that we know who can be trusted and who is already working for Harkon." Leila's mind raced. "How can I help if they are already so close to you?" "There are servants in the palace who overhear things, who see what others do not," King Edward replied, leaning forward slightly. "I need you to watch them. Pay attention to their behavior, to who speaks with whom. If there are signs of treason, I need you to report them." Quietly, of course. Her pulse quickened. "And what if I discover something dangerous?" The king's eyes darkened. "Then you must act. Harkon and his supporters will not hesitate to destroy anyone who gets in their way. You will be our eyes and ears." Leila nodded, her thoughts a whirlwind of uncertainty and resolve. The task ahead of her was more dangerous than anything she could have imagined, but there was no turning back now. That night, as she returned to the servants' quarters, her mind raced with questions. How would she find the traitors in a palace full of whispers and half-truths? And what would she do if she was discovered? Clara caught her as she was walking down the hall. "Leila, you look like you've seen a ghost." Leila forced a smile, trying to keep her emotions hidden. "I'm just tired, Clara. It's been a long day." Clara raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "You're not alone, you know," she said softly. "We're all in this together. If something's going wrong, you can count on me." Leila hesitated, her mind torn. She had no idea who could be trusted in the palace, and even Clara's kind words seemed too good to be true in a place so filled with deception. "Thank you, Clara," she said quietly. "I'll keep that in mind." The next day, Leila began her quiet watch. She moved through the halls, her eyes and ears open for any sign of suspicion. It was exhausting trying to blend into the background while keeping track of every conversation, every movement. But there were moments, fleeting moments, where she felt a chill run down her spine as though she were being watched herself. She overheard bits and pieces, furtive conversations between guards, quick exchanges between noblewomen. Most of it was nothing, but one conversation in particular caught her attention. Two men were speaking in low voices just outside the kitchens. One was Lord Harkon's right-hand man, a cruel and calculating figure named Regan. The other was a guard, someone Leila had seen around but never spoken to. "We need to move soon," Regan was saying, his voice tight with impatience. "The king's health is deteriorating and the council is growing restless. Once we have control, we can move forward with the plan." "The servants will be a problem," the guard replied, his voice uncertain. "There's one girl who's been asking questions. Leila, I think her name is." Leila's blood ran cold. They were talking about her. Regan's voice dropped lower. "Don't worry about her. If she's too curious, we'll deal with her. The king will be out of the way soon enough, and then no one will matter." Leila barely managed to stifle a gasp. They knew her name. They knew she had been listening. Her every move was being watched. As she moved away, her mind was racing. She had to tell the king. She had to act before it was too late. That night, as the palace settled into uneasy silence, Leila slipped away from her quarters once again. She made her way to the king's private chambers, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. But as she reached the door, she froze. 2 guards stood at attention outside the king's chamber. She couldn't risk being caught. No. The air in the palace had grown thicker, as if the very walls were holding their breath in anticipation. Leila could feel it in the way the guards' eyes lingered on her, the way the other servants spoke in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. The palace, once a place of routine and silence, had become a place of secrets and fear. After her conversation with Clara, Leila couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. She and Clara had agreed to stay close, to keep their eyes and ears open, but each passing day brought new tension, and with it, new dangers. Leila had to act quickly. That night, after a long day of chores, Leila found herself alone in the darkened kitchens. Clara had warned her to be cautious, but Leila couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something she wasn't seeing, something important that would change everything. She was about to step outside when a figure stepped into the doorway. Her breath caught as she recognized the tall, imposing figure. It was Aldrich. "Leila," he said, his voice low and menacing, "I've been looking for you." Her heart skipped a beat, but she managed to keep her composure. "What is it, Aldrich?" she asked, trying to sound calm despite the fear that gripped her. "I need you to come with me," he said, his tone unyielding. "The king has requested your presence." Leila's stomach dropped. The king? Was he finally ready to act? Or had something gone terribly wrong? She followed Aldrich through the labyrinth of corridors, her thoughts spinning. Every step seemed to echo in the silence of the palace, and the weight of the guards' gazes pressed heavily on her. When they reached the king's private chambers, Aldrich gave her a sharp look before knocking on the door. "Your Majesty," he called, "Leila is here." The door creaked open, and Leila stepped inside. King Edward sat at the far end of the room, his once commanding presence diminished by the illness that seemed to drain him more each day. His eyes were tired but sharp, and for a moment they held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Leila," he said softly, "please come closer." She obeyed, moving cautiously toward the king's chair. "I have something to ask of you," he continued, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet urgency. "There is a banquet tomorrow night. I need you to help me with something very important. Can I trust you?" Leila nodded without hesitation. "Of course, Your Majesty. I'll do whatever is needed." The king's gaze softened for a moment before he spoke again. "The banquet will be a gathering of many powerful people. I suspect that Harkon will make his move during the event. I want you to watch him. Watch everyone closely. We need to know who is truly loyal and who is working against us." Leila's heart raced. She had known the banquet would be crucial, but now it felt like the final act was beginning. Everything depended on her ability to uncover the truth. "I will, Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady. King Edward's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he nodded. "Good. And be careful, Leila. You are more valuable than you realize." The weight of his words settled on her shoulders as she left the room, her mind already spinning with plans. She knew that this was her chance. If she could gather enough information at the banquet, she could finally uncover the truth behind Harkon's treachery and put an end to the danger before it was too late. But as she walked down the palace halls, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air felt charged, and every step she took seemed to echo in the silence. She couldn't help but feel as though she were being watched. The night of the banquet arrived. The grand hall was alive with the sound of laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. The nobles and guests had gathered, all dressed in their finest clothes, each one playing their part in the delicate dance of power and intrigue. Leila, dressed in a simple gown, moved silently among the guests, her eyes constantly scanning the room. She kept close to the serving tables, offering drinks and food to the nobles as they passed. Her every sense was heightened as she searched for any sign of treason. Her first stop was the table where Lord Harkon sat, his sharp features framed by the soft glow of candlelight. He was engaged in a conversation with a group of his allies, but Leila was careful not to make her presence known. She moved closer, just within earshot, listening to the subtle hints in their words. "We need to move quickly," Lord Harkon was saying. "The king is weaker than we thought. The council is already prepared to act. We'll have the throne before the end of the week." Leila's pulse quickened. So it was true. Harkon had already made his move, and the king was in far more danger than anyone realized. She tried to memorize every word, every gesture, but Leila's heart pounded in her chest as Aldrich's cold, calculating eyes fixed on her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. There was no turning back now. The truth was out, and the danger was closer than she had ever imagined. "Leila," Aldrich repeated, his voice low but firm. "I've been watching you. I know you've been gathering information. It's over." For a fleeting moment, panic surged through her, but she quickly masked it with a calm she didn't entirely feel. She had to think fast. If she didn't act now, everything she had worked for would unravel in an instant. "I don't know what you're talking about," Leila said, her voice steady, though her pulse raced. She took a careful step back, putting distance between herself and the two men. Aldrich smirked, clearly enjoying the game. "Don't lie to me, girl. I know exactly what you've been doing. You think you can protect the king, but you're just a pawn in this game." Leila's mind whirled. She couldn't afford to be caught now. There had to be another way out. Then a thought struck her, Clara. She had to warn Clara before they discovered everything. She couldn't let them reach the king before she did. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said quickly, her voice rising just slightly to cover the urgency in her words. "I'm just doing my duty." The guard at Aldrich's side stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Your duty? You think you can fool anyone? We know about the note, the conversations." He reached for his sword. "You've been digging too deep." Leila's breath caught in her throat. There was no more pretending. She had to make a choice. She couldn't let them drag her to the dungeons, and she couldn't let Harkon's plan succeed. The king's life was at stake. Without thinking, Leila turned and bolted down the hall, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear the heavy thud of Aldrich's boots following her, gaining on her with every step. She rounded a corner, her mind racing for a way out. She had to get to the king. She had to warn him. But as she ran, she realized with horror that the path to the royal chambers was blocked. Aldrich had anticipated her move. In desperation, she darted into a side passage, a narrow hallway that led to the servants' quarters. She could hear Aldrich's voice growing fainter behind her, but she knew it wouldn't be long before they caught up to her. She reached the servants' quarters in a panic, bursting through the door. Clara was there, just as she had hoped. "Clara!" Leila gasped, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. "We have to move. They know they're coming for me." Clara's eyes widened in alarm as she quickly locked the door behind her. "What happened? How did they find out?" "It doesn't matter," Leila said, her voice urgent. "We have to warn the king. Harkon's plan is already in motion, and Aldrich, he's working with them. We don't have much time." Clara's face grew pale as she processed the gravity of the situation. "But how do we get to the king? The palace is crawling with guards." Leila's mind raced. There had to be a way. She had come so far, and she couldn't let it all fall apart now. Then an idea sparked in her mind. "Follow me," she said, her voice sharp with determination. "I know a way." She grabbed Clara's arm, leading her down the narrow corridors, carefully avoiding the main hall where the guards would surely be watching. The silence was suffocating, but Leila pressed on, her resolve stronger than ever. As they moved deeper into the palace, Leila couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet made her tense. Every shadow felt like it was hiding an enemy. But she kept going, pushing forward, until they reached the hidden passageway that led directly to the king's chambers. The passage was dark and narrow, lined with old stone walls. It was a forgotten path, one that only a few trusted servants knew about. Leila had discovered it years ago when she had first arrived at the palace, and now it was the only chance she had to get to the king undetected. But as they approached the entrance to the chamber, Leila felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. "We have to hurry," she whispered to Clara. Clara nodded, her face pale, but the terror in her eyes matched Leila's own. They stepped cautiously into the dimly lit hallway outside the king's chambers, but as they neared the door, a voice stopped them cold. "It's too late." Leila froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing in the doorway of the king's chambers was Aldrich, his eyes dark with menace. "I knew you would try something," he said with a twisted smile. "But you're too late, Leila. The king is already ours." Leila's mind raced. There was no way out now. She had failed. She had come so close, but now it seemed that all. The air in the royal chambers was thick with tension as Aldrich's smug expression faltered, and his hand instinctively went to his sword. But the king's guards, swift and silent, surrounded him before he could make a move. Leila's breath caught in her throat as the realization sank in. King Edward had known of the conspiracy all along. Aldrich stood frozen for a moment, his eyes darting between the king, his guards, and Leila. He was cornered, his plan unraveling faster than he could react. The room was heavy with silence, the weight of the king's presence pressing down on everyone. "You should have known better, Aldrich," King Edward said quietly, his voice filled with quiet authority. "No matter how many you recruit, no matter how deep you burrow into my palace, you will never have my crown." Aldrich sneered, his eyes flashing with defiance. "You're weak, Edward. The throne is mine for the taking. You've been a puppet for far too long." But before he could make another move, a swift motion from the guards had him disarmed and restrained, kneeling before the king. Leila could hardly believe her eyes. The man who had caused so much chaos and fear, the man who had plotted against the kingdom's very heart, was now helpless. King Edward stepped forward, his frail form still commanding attention. "You will be taken to the dungeons where you will await your trial. There, you will answer for your crimes." Aldrich, now seething with rage, muttered under his breath, "You think this is over. You'll never win. The people will rise. The crown will fall." "Enough!" The king's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Your words mean nothing now. It is your actions that will be remembered." The guards escorted Aldrich out of the chamber, and a tense silence settled over the room. Leila felt the weight lift from her shoulders, though the fear that had haunted her for so long still clung to her like a shadow. The king turned his gaze to her, and for the first time she saw a softness in his eyes, an expression of gratitude. "You've done well, Leila," he said quietly. "Without your courage, I would have lost everything." Leila lowered her gaze, her heart swelling with both relief and exhaustion. "I only did what was right, Your Majesty." King Edward smiled faintly. "You have done more than you realize. You've saved this kingdom, and for that you will be rewarded." Leila's eyes widened. "Rewarded?" "Indeed," the king said, his voice becoming more certain. "I have no heirs. My time is coming to an end, and it is you who have shown me that true loyalty and honor lie not in power, but in the people who stand by you in times of darkness." Leila's heart skipped a beat. "But I'm just a servant, Your Majesty." The king chuckled softly. "And yet you have shown more wisdom and strength than many of those born into power. You have earned your place among the kingdom's future leaders." Leila's world seemed to spin as the weight of the king's words settled on her. She had always been just a humble servant, her name forgotten in the midst of the palace's grandeur. But now, it seemed, fate had a different plan for her. "The kingdom needs someone who can see the truth, even when it is hidden in shadows," King Edward said. "And I believe you are that person, Leila. I have already made the arrangements. Tomorrow, you will be given the title of Royal Advisor. Your counsel will be valued and your voice will be heard." Leila could hardly believe it. Royal Advisor. The title felt foreign on her tongue, and the thought of wielding such influence in a place that had once been so cold and distant seemed impossible. But she couldn't deny the truth in the king's words. "And what of the future?" she asked, her voice trembling with the enormity of the responsibility she was being asked to bear. The king's expression grew solemn, and he stepped closer. "The kingdom is at a crossroads. There will be challenges ahead. Harkon's betrayal has left wounds that will take time to heal. But I have faith in you, Leila. You will help lead this kingdom into a new era, one where power is not a weapon, but a tool for unity and prosperity." Tears welled in Leila's eyes as she looked at the king, seeing him not as the frail ruler he had become, but as the man who had once commanded the respect of an entire kingdom. The weight of her duty was immense, but for the first time in her life, she felt a sense of purpose beyond anything she had ever known. "I will not fail you, Your Majesty," Leila said, her voice steady. "I will do everything I can to honor the trust you've placed in me." King Edward placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of affection. "I know you will. And together we will ensure that the darkness of betrayal never again overshadows this kingdom." As the king's words hung in the air, Leila felt a new strength rise within her. The journey had been long, filled with fear and uncertainty, but it had a